In the first part of Chapter 9, we looked at how to use a single plant-wide rate or departmental rates to allocate overhead. In this section, we're going to look at a different philosophy for allocating overhead, that is, activity-based costing. Like departmental rates, activity-based costing is a two-stage system. In other words, first, we have to separate our overhead into pools. The difference is that under departmental costing, the pools are based on the department that is responsible for the overhead. In activity-based costing, the pools depend on the activities that caused overhead costs to come into existence. Once we've established our pools and assigned all of our overhead costs to specific pools, then the second stage is to allocate the costs from the pools to our cost object, the thing that we are trying to find out. How much does this thing cost us? So the cost object could be a department, it could be a product, it could be a batch of product, or any other thing that we are trying to cost. So in this procedure, we need to identify activities that consume our firm's resources and pool our costs according to the activities that cause them to come into existence. For each pool, we need to identify a cost driver, the thing that we believe causes costs to increase when the amount of the driver increases. Then we're going to take the total amount in each pool, divide by the total amount of the cost driver, and that is going to give us an allocation rate for that pool. Then, when we want to assign costs to various cost objects, we need to take the driver rate and multiply it by the amount of the cost driver that was used by a particular cost object. Say, how much was used by a product. And that will give us the amount of the costs from that pool to be assigned to that cost object. There are a number of potential cost drivers for any pool. A cost driver is the thing that causes or creates the costs in that pool. So, for example, when it comes to something like material ordering costs, the thing that creates those costs is the act of ordering materials. Therefore, a good cost driver for material ordering costs is the number of orders that are placed. Products or processes that require more orders deserve more of the costs of ordering materials. When it comes to machine setup costs, you need to understand your own firm. Every time a firm must stop production and do something to the machinery to get it ready for a particular kind of activity, this is called a machine setup. In other words, work stops All of our production employees stand around waiting while a technician comes and makes the necessary adjustments, and then production resumes. So there's a cost associated with each setup. The cost of time that workers are being paid but aren't actually manufacturing anything, the technician's time, any supplies that are needed for the setup, and of course, lost productivity. So, what's the appropriate driver for setup costs? Well, it could be the number of setups. However, if a firm feels that some of its setups are more complicated than others, rather than using number of setups, a firm might choose to use setup hours instead. If the firm does that, then more of these costs would be associated with jobs that have more complicated setups. There is no gap on this subject. Every firm gets to decide what makes the most sense. The penalty for choosing the wrong cost driver is the firm doesn't understand its own cost structure as well as it would if it had thought harder and made a better choice. When it comes to material handling costs, the cost to move materials around our factory, we have a number of choices as well. We could use the number of production runs. In other words, every time we have a production run for a particular product, we have to move things around to get all the materials that we need for that production. Alternatively, we might assign material handling cost based on how many different types of materials we need. Or we might base it on how many pounds of materials we need. Part of your skill as a cost accountant for a particular firm is in understanding how your firm operates so that you can choose the most appropriate cost driver. When it comes to machine costs, typically the number of machine hours is used as the cost driver. When it comes to something like shipping and handling costs, it could be the number of shipments for each product, or it could be the weight of the shipments if we feel that we have products with significantly different weights to them, or it could be the distance shipped, whatever it is that we feel is most appropriate. Another interesting thing about activity-based costing that does not happen with other cost allocation methods is the idea of a cost hierarchy. A single plant-wide rate and departmental allocation rates use volume-based drivers, usually either machine hours or labor hours or labor costs or number of units to allocate all of the costs in a single plant-wide pool or in departmental pools. However, not all costs are volume related. So using something like machine hours or labor costs may be very appropriate for costs that we believe are proportional to the number of units that we make. But not all costs behave that way. Some costs are batch related. That is, they occur every time we decide to make a batch of a particular product, but it doesn't matter how many units are in that batch. Examples of batch-related costs would include setup costs. If we're going to start making a particular product, we need to set up our machinery, but once it's set up, we can make as many units of that product as we want to. The same would be true for material handling costs or shipping costs. They really occur on a per batch basis, not on a per unit basis. Some of our costs may be product related. In other words, they don't occur for every unit or even every batch, but they occur for each product, regardless of how many units of that product we make. Compliance costs are the costs to comply with various regulations, and many industries, industries that make food, industries that make pharmaceuticals, industries that make chemicals, have to comply with regulations, and there is a cost to that compliance, but it only happens once per product, not once per unit or once per batch. If you try to use a volume-based driver like machine hours or labor dollars to allocate batch-related or product-related costs, you are going to over-allocate those costs to your high-volume products, and you are going to under-allocate those costs to your low-volume or specialty products. Finally, we have some costs that are not related to the number of units or the number of batches or the number of products that we make. They are related to the number of facilities that we have. So, for example, we have rent on our factory, we have insurance on our factory, we have depreciation on our factory equipment. That happens once per factory in a way that is unrelated to the number of units that we make or the number of batches or the number of products. A single plant-wide overhead rate or departmental rates are not designed to reflect the fact that not all costs are volume-based. Only activity-based costing can do that. So, if you remember in the previous section, we were looking at rev-em-up, and we said that the cost accountant was considering other methods besides a single plant-wide rate for allocating the firm's manufacturing overhead. Well, now the accountant has gone to a workshop on activity-based costing, and as a result, he took a look at the firm's production and decided to see whether a switch to activity-based costing might be beneficial. So let's see what he found. In the machining department, the accountant found that there were two major activity pools. One was setup costs, and the other was machining costs. And after consulting with the production manager, the cost accountant decided that number of setups was the appropriate cost driver for setup costs, and machine hours was the appropriate driver for machining costs. In the assembly department, the cost accountant decided that we should pool assembly costs and use labor hours as the cost driver, and separately pool inspection costs and use number of inspections as the cost driver. And so the cost accountant gathered a bunch of data for the firm's 3 products, alpha, beta, and gamma. Now, the next thing that the cost accountant had to do was pool those costs. So, in the machining department, which had a total of $900,000 of departmental overhead, the cost accountant had to decide how much of those costs belonged to setting things up and how much belonged to machining the firm's products. In the assembly department, which had $450,000 of total overhead, again, the cost accountant had to decide, out of all of that overhead, how much of it really belonged to the act of assembling the firm's products and how much of it belonged to inspecting those products. Altogether, all of the individual cost pools must equal the total overhead cost that the firm has, because all costs have to go somewhere. Once we have pooled our costs, the next step is to determine the driver rate for each pool. The formula is total amount of cost in that pool divided by the total amount of the cost driver for that pool gives us our driver rate, or our activity rate. So, in the machining department, we said that we had $150,000 of activity-based overhead that we pooled together because it all related to setups. So we divide by the number of setups, and that gives us a rate. Assign $600 of setup costs for each setup that is required for any product that we make. For machining, we take the total amount in the machining pool and we divide by the total number of machine hours, and that gives us a rate. Assign $125 of machining overhead costs for each hour that is spent machining a particular product. In the assembly department, we take the total amount of overhead costs in the assembly pool and divide by labor hours, because we chose that as our cost driver, and that tells us to assign $8 of assembling overhead to any product for each labor hour spent working on that product. Finally, the inspection pool we need to allocate based on the number of inspections, and we find that we should allocate $900 of inspection costs for each inspection that we need to perform. Now, when we look at this information, we can't help noticing the firm is spending a lot of resources every time we have to set up the machines to go from doing one kind of task to a different kind of task. We also notice that we're spending a lot of resources on inspections. So the cost accountant's first thought is, are these really value-added costs, that is, things that customers care about and are willing to pay for, or are they perhaps non-value-added costs, that is, costs that are not perceivable by the customer. The customer can't tell whether this thing happened, and therefore they're not willing to pay for it. Well, at first you might think that setups and inspections are necessary, that they are value added, but the truth is they're not. They are a choice that we make. We can have a lot of setups, or we could plan our production so that we don't need as many setups. Same thing with inspections. The reason we have inspections is because we do not trust our own manufacturing process to do things right. If we knew for sure that our manufacturing system was going to be perfect, it was going to do everything exactly the way it was supposed to, we wouldn't need to do inspections. One of the benefits of activity-based costing is that it makes costs visible to us so that we can decide whether it's worthwhile trying to think of another way to organize our production process to reduce some of these costs that customers can't perceive. The next thing that we need to do is to assign our overhead costs. The direct materials and direct labor costs haven't changed. They are not affected by our choice of allocation method, so they really came from the information in Part A of Chapter 9. What we need to do now is to allocate the overhead from our 4 pools: setups, machining, assembly, and inspections, onto our 3 products using our activity-based rates. So for the setup pool, we said it was $600 per setup. The alpha product used 125 setups during the period, so we multiply the setup rate times the number of setups that this product used to determine how much setup cost is assigned to the alpha product. We can do the same thing with beta. Beta only used 75 setups at $600 per setup. That means that the beta product gets less of the setup costs because it required less of the activity that caused these costs to exist. When it comes to the gamma product used even less. It only used 50 setups, so it gets even less of these costs. We can do the same thing for machining. The allocation rate was $125 per machine hour times the number of machine hours that alpha used times the number of machine hours that beta used and times the number of machine hours that gamma used. We can do the same thing with assembly costs. It was $8 per labor hour of allocated overhead from the assembly pool times the number of labor hours for alpha times the number of labor hours for beta times the number of labor hours for gamma. And finally, we have the inspection pool at $900 per inspection. Alpha required 50 inspections. That means they get $45,000 out of this pool. Beta only required 25 inspections, so they get significantly less of the inspection overhead. Gamma also used 25 inspections. Once we have allocated all of our overhead costs, we can add them up to determine how much of our total overhead is assigned to Alpha. Then we can add in our materials and our labor for Alpha to get the total costs under activity-based costing, divide by the number of units of Alpha that we produced, and that gives us a cost per unit. We can do the same thing for Beta. We can add up all of the overhead, add in the materials and labor costs, and divide by the number of units of Beta that we made to get a cost per unit. Finally, we can do the same thing for Gamma. Add up the overhead costs, add in the materials and labor costs, divide by the total number of units to get a cost per unit. I made you a chart of the results that we got for each of the products under the three methods that we explored: the single plant-wide rate based on machine hours, departmental rates, and activity-based costing. The first thing that we notice is that the values that we computed under a single plant-wide rate are significantly different from the values under departmental rates or activity-based costing. This occurs because, if you remember, Gamma uses significantly more machine hours than the other two products. So anything that is based solely on machine hours as the allocation base is going to give too much overhead to Gamma, not enough to the other products. So, looking at these results overall, it seems that this firm gets about the same cost allocation using departmental rates and using activity-based costing. In that case, if I were the cost accountant for this firm, I would probably recommend departmental rates. They're much easier to use and much less expensive to use than activity-based costing because they require less record keeping, less data collection. If I thought that it was important to our understanding of our own cost structure to use activity-based costing, I would absolutely do it. But I wouldn't do it unless I felt that the information value that I received was worth the additional work, the additional record keeping, the additional cost. Now, what if Rev-em-up prices its goods based on their cost? In that case, the price that we assign to these goods is going to be significantly affected by the costing method that we choose. So, let's say the firm marks up its goods to 150% of cost. We can compute the price that we would charge under traditional costing versus, for example, activity-based costing. When we do this, we can see that because alpha was under-costed under traditional costing, it's going to be underpriced compared to the price that we would charge if we used activity-based costing. The same is true for beta. However, gamma was over-costed. It received more than its fair share of overhead costs under a traditional costing system. Therefore, it would be overpriced in the market compared to a firm that used activity-based costing. This finding that when we assign too much cost to one product, by definition, that means we're not going to assign enough cost to some other product, is called cross-subsidization, and it's a very serious problem. Let's say that all of our competitors know more about cost accounting than we do, and they're all using activity-based costing when we are still using traditional costing. In that case, they're charging $120 for their alpha when we're charging $116. So of course we're going to sell a lot of alpha. Same thing for beta. But why are people buying our product? They're buying it because we are not actually charging enough. We are not getting 150% of cost because our alpha and beta really cost us more than we think. By contrast, we're charging more than our competitors for gamma because we are over costing that product. We're giving it more overhead cost than it really deserves. Therefore, our gamma product is not going to sell well in the market because our competitors understand what it truly costs them. If you find that some of your products are not selling well, that they're overpriced in the market and nobody's buying them, whereas other products are selling very well, but you can't seem to make the profit that you expected, chances are that you are using a costing system that doesn't really give you a good sense of how much your various products cost you to produce.